Are we recording already, Arnold?
Yeah, the record light just came on.
No introduction?
Yeah, if you look at the top right,
Yes, I'll introduce myself.
there's a red light there which shows it's recording.
Okay. Well, I guess I will introduce myself. So, Uncle Pete's Corner number 8. Today we're going to talk about the WebDev session timeout settings, how to work with them, how to avoid them knocking your users out of your website. And while we're at it, we'll gather some information to use for some usage statistics later on. So there's my very own introduction. I guess I should have taken advantage and said, you know, the super duper wonderful Uncle Pete or something, but we'll let it go.
I'm sorry, I did introduce you, but I had my mic muted. Hey, you want to start all over again?
It's really
so hard
to
for him, Arnold. It's
Okay.
really early for Arnold, you know.
Well, I was sniffling, and so I didn't want to do that. You want me to start all over again?
No, we're absolutely fine, sir.
Okay, go for it.
All right, so session timeouts. When you're using a WebDev dynamic site, you set a session timeout, and there's a couple of places where you can set that timeout. First, in the WebDev administrator, which I had in here right up until I decided to talk about it, and then it went away. On another site. There it is again. In the WebDev administrator, you have this. Well, that's my problem there. By default, this is set to 20 minutes, which means that anytime a user connects to your dynamic site, WebDev is going to maintain that session for 20 minutes, which means it's going to reserve some memory space and hold the global variables and whatever your app has globally defined to keep track of. It's going to hold that for 20 minutes. So if that user doesn't do anything, there's no contact with that user for 20 minutes, it'll disconnect that user and go away. So that also means that for a total of 20 minutes, you're using that memory space. So if somebody comes to your site, logs on, and then immediately closes their browser, you've still reserved that chunk of memory for another 20 minutes before you're going to release that memory. You start getting a site that's very active with a lot of logged in users, that's going to be an issue for you because every one of those users is using that memory. So you want to crank down that idle time. The only problem is the other side of that issue is if you have that time too short and you have a site that requires the user to read some stuff on the screen, do some data entry, whatever it is, you're going to get a situation where they take too long to do that page before they respond. The browser is going to think that they have gone away and it's going to drop that session. So then when they click on the OK button, they're going to get that great error message that says your session has timed out, you need to restart the web application. And they're going to lose all the data entry they did. They're going to not like you and call you bad names. Just a bad thing.
As if they don't do that anyway.
So, yeah, well, you know, depends on the user.
Yeah.
So we've got a balancing act that we're trying to maintain between keeping the server resources freed up and keeping the user session going. You have two places that you set the user session timeout. Globally for all your sites, is on the configuration tab of the administrator. You can also set it specifically for each site of your WebDev server. If you use default, it's going to use whatever comes from the configuration tab, but you can also set custom parameters and set it specifically for each site. And when you publish a site, as you step through the wizard, you'll get a spot where it'll ask you if you want to override and set these custom settings. Or you can actually come into the WebDev administrator and change them there as well. So that's where you do all the settings, and I had this down to 1 minute playing, so I need to change that, otherwise we'll get weirdness here. Sure that really took, because a while ago it didn't. So what I've been doing is I set mine to 10 minutes. The problem with that is that's not long enough if you have a really interactive site that people are doing true data entry on, because 10 minutes is going to cause them to sometimes time out while they're just thinking whatever. So we have to come up with a way to get around that. Well, how we get around that is by setting up a little procedure. It runs on a timer that goes out there and touches the server every minute to keep the site alive. So as long as that user's got the browser window open, let me step back for a minute and talk about how WebDev knows whether the user's still there or not. Remember, browser and server are completely disconnected. The server renders a page, sends it to the browser, and then at that point there is no further communications between that server and that browser. As far as the server knows, that user could be there, could not be there. All the server is doing is saying, okay, I know who I sent that to, and I'm going to remember everything I've done with them for the next 20 minutes. If they don't stick up their hand and send something back to me in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to forget about it. What happens is when you submit a page, you're now talking to that server again, which now resets your session timeout because the server has heard from you again. It knows you're there. So as long as the user is moving through your pages, doing something interactive that retouches that server, they stay within the session timeout. Well, again, if they're on a page for too long, they're going to go over that time limit. By making an AJAX call, even though the user's just doing browser stuff, if we set up an AJAX call on a timer, then we can go touch that server just enough to let that server know we're still alive. The server will reset its timeout and won't drop our connection. So that's what we're going to do, is set up an AJAX procedure on a timer that's going to go touch the server every minute. So now, as long as that user's browser window is open to our site, every minute the server is going to get touched, and we're never going to have a timeout. Now, the downside to this is a user keeps their browser open for 6 days. We're going to maintain their session for 6 days. But, you know, that if they're using a Windows machine, the chances of them keeping a browser open for 6 days, it's pretty impressive.
Well, can you track any activity?
Meaning what?
Well, just not being on, but there's activity going on.
No, remember, you know nothing about the browser.
Yeah, that's...
You can't see what's happening on the browser. You can't. All you can do is get a submission back from the browser.
Yeah, but what I think Arnold and I'm thinking is if he's got activity inside the browser code can detect it on it. even though it's not talking back to the server. For example, he goes
Right.
from one entry field to the next. That in itself doesn't trigger back to the server, but can you not have code inside the browser?
Yeah, you could.
Then if he has no activity within the browser, it won't refresh it to the server.
Yeah, you could do that. I mean, you'd be having to have a little bit of code on every entry control. I don't know. I'd have to see a site that, if I've got a site that it's going to be that much of an issue with, I suspect I'm going to make that site an AWP site, and I wouldn't have this issue at all.
Oh, okay, all right, thanks.
Follow me? Yeah, okay. An AWP site works differently than a WebDev dynamic site. An AWP site doesn't hold memory with session variables and stuff the same way as
you have to do
WebDev.
You have to do all the session holding and all the bits and pieces.
Right. So you wouldn't have these same issues.
Yeah. Where the other one is more like a Windows programming method.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So you know, if you've got a very active site, you know, and you've got hundreds and thousands of users online constantly, you probably want to look at an AWP site. You know, it's a little different animal. You know, it's a little harder to program. It's just about getting your head around it. WebDev dynamic, and I think you said it very well there, Wolfgang. It's kind of like Windows programming.
Yeah.
You know, it takes some of that heavy lifting for us.
Yeah.
Precisely. And the downside of that is you can start running into memory problems, or even if you leave it at 20 minutes, you know, some of my business applications, it's nothing for a user to, you know, start on an entry screen, get a phone call, get distracted. That 20 minutes goes by, they lose their data. So,
tell me, just out of your experience, on average, how much memory does it reserve per session?
There's actually a formula for it that's in the implementation of the when you buy the WAS server, the document that comes with it has a little formula in there, and it's really not a lot. I seem to think that it's 64K, 8 handles, and a couple other bits and pieces is what you start with, and then of course every global variable, and that's where people get in trouble.
Okay, then
you know, because if you're still doing procedural style coding, and you've got a ton of global variables, that's what's going to get you in trouble.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
So that's really what it comes down to. You know, and I don't really think that a lot of us are going to run into as much of a resource problem. I really think until you get at least 50 users on a machine, you don't even really need to be thinking about resource problems. It's just really not that big of a deal. But what will happen to you, even take the resource issue out of the equation, in a business style application, you know, which a lot of us are doing SaaS type applications, you don't want that user to time out and lose their data entry work, regardless of if it takes them 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes to fill out a screen. You know, your Windows application doesn't say, oh, sorry, you haven't done anything for 20 minutes, I'm knocking you out and losing your setup.
Yeah.
So why would your web application do that? Yeah, and that a lot of web applications do that, and that's one of the reasons users don't like the experience, the same as they like the experience of a Windows application.
Especially banking and trade shares websites, they tend to knock you out quickly.
Precisely. So what we're doing by doing this AJAX call is we're saying as long as that user's logged into my website and keeps their browser open on my website, I want to maintain that session and that connection to them. So all we do is set up a procedure that runs every minute, and we do it with an AJAX asynchronous call, which means that it doesn't affect the user whatsoever. It doesn't halt them, stop them. It runs on basically its own thread, goes and just pokes the server, doesn't take any time at all, just pokes the server and says, hey, I'm still here, and keeps that communication going. As soon as the browser window closes or the user moves on to another site and is no longer connected to our site, well, our timer is going to quit running, and then the server's not going to get poked. It's going to drop the connection, and away we go. So the best way to accomplish all this, and this is kind of one of those, I believe we've said it a few times, use page templates. And I'll drag over the task cure here for just a second. You'll notice on the task cure, I've actually got a few different templates. I've got the base template, which is the basic look of the site. But then I also have an external template and an internal template. And there's very little difference between the two other than you have login information up at the top, where on the internal site, I know they're already logged in, so you've got links for my account, that sort of thing. But the other difference is the internal site pages are the pages where the user is already logged on, and I can track their statistics and so forth. So by having those different templates, I can control that timer procedure that's running based on that, so that I can use a little different code for a logged on user versus a non-logged on user. And I'll show you why we would want to do that here in just a second. So for our sample site here, we just got one template. And if we look at this template, the only code in it is this code that says record time. Timer, record time, 6,000. Timer is setting up a timed event. Record time is the browser procedure it's going to run. And 6,000 is hundredths of a second that it's going to fire. So that means that record time is going to fire once every minute. And you'll see that I'm doing this in the onload web browser procedure, which means that any page that is using my template is going to have this line of code. So now if we come over to our home page and we look at the code, let me refresh it. We see that that line of code is there. So now every page of my site, as long as I base it off of that template, is going to set up the record time procedure for me. So now I don't have to think about it any longer. As long as I'm using the page template, I'm going to have this feature enabled on every one of my pages. I don't have to remember to put the code on my page or anything like that. So that's the advantage of doing it on a template. So now let's look at what record time does. And of course, it's a browser procedure because you have to call a browser procedure from a timer event. A timer event is a browser event. And it does one line of code. It does an AJAX execute asynchronous, update time on site, AJAX callback. Okay, AJAX execute is how you have a browser procedure talk to the server, because again, we're in that browser versus server mode. Browser can't touch server, server can't touch browser. AJAX is how we cross that gap. The only two ways for browser and server to communicate is via AJAX or for you to do a submission of the page where it actually transmits everything to the server and then the server re-renders a new page. Well, obviously we don't want to do that every minute, so we're going to want to use AJAX. Now when you start looking at doing AJAX executes, there's two different types of AJAX executes you can do. You can do an AJAX execute or you can do an AJAX execute asynchronous. The difference between the two, if you do an AJAX execute, it will sit there and wait for a response from the server. So anything else that's happening in the browser will halt until it gets that response back from the server, and then it'll move on. Asynchronous says, go run this procedure, but just can carry on with what you're doing. So that's what we're doing. Because we don't want the user to even know that anything's happening with this timed event every minute. You know, that would drive them nuts if we're touching something every minute. So we're going to do the asynchronous style call. When you do the asynchronous style call, you give it two procedures. The procedure you're calling, which now this is a server procedure, because remember AJAX is going to call something on the server. So update time on site is a server procedure. And then AJAX callback is the name of the procedure that when the server gets done, it's going to make a call to AJAX callback, which is this procedure. And you see I don't have any code in here. I just defined the stub so that it'd have something to call. So that's how, if any of you have worked with ActiveX or COM objects, you have callback events. Basically, that's what AJAX execute asynchronous is doing, is there's a callback event. So you're merely doing whatever you want to do. When AJAX execute asynchronous calls the server, and then you go back to doing what you're doing. When the server gets done doing its work, it makes a call to AJAX callback, passes the result as one of the variables, and it also it passes AJAX call, which tells you what made the call, so that you could put some logic in here of knowing what procedure did or didn't call, started this process off. So now you could put some code in this browser procedure, and we get time today. We may play with that. One of the things that we can do with this is to update a time up in the corner of time on site or something like that. Or, you know, it could also be used to, you know, if it's a long call that's looking up some information for like a time ticker that, you know, the user's just working, but you're updating a chatterbox type window over in the corner, you could make an asynchronous call, and every time it gets new data, it would update that chatterbox, all without interrupting the user. So that's what the callback would be used for. Now let's look at the actual code that we want to execute. Update time on site. Remember, again, this is a server procedure. Notice it's yellow. And we have to make it AJAX enabled since we're calling it via AJAX. And all it does is say if there is a current user ID, then go get the user, update their time on site, and save the record. And then it returns a result, because AJAX procedures return a result. And one trick that it's very subtle in the documentation, but will get you in trouble, is AJAX has to return a string. It can't return numerics or anything. It has to return a string value. So in this instance, I don't care about what it's returning. I just want it to return something. So I'm just returning a space. The reason I'm doing current user ID does not equal 0 is in case I haven't logged on that user yet. Okay, I still want to keep the site alive, but obviously there's no user stats to record. And if you're just wanting to keep your site alive, you don't need any of that code there. All you need is update time on site and return a result, because again, all you're trying to do is touch that server so that that server knows you're still alive. So if all you're trying to accomplish is to keep your session timeout from knocking your user off, literally all you have to do is an AJAX asynchronous call to touch that server and you're done. But instead I went ahead and said, as long as I'm touching that server every minute, let's keep track of how long our users stay logged in, because that's probably an important statistic that we'd like to know at some point. So all I do is go get the current user, and then in the user file I have a variable called time on site that's defined as a duration, and to that I add 1 minute, and I probably spent the most time of all the code that we've looked at on this statement right here. String to duration, and you got to love our friends on the other side of the globe. There are 2 different formats for durations. One has I believe it's microsecond.
One is hundreds,
there's
the other
an
one's
extra
thousands.
0. Yeah. And for some reason, some of the functions have that extra 0, some of the functions don't have that extra 0. And, not a big deal, except that instead of writing out a minute, you're writing out 10 minutes, which, will make a difference at some point. So that's what the duration milli is saying, that this is formatted in the millisecond with that extra 0 on it versus not. And I really think that the reason that they did that is because the actual timer is hundredths of a second, so milliseconds really never has anything in it. It would always be 0 if you're using the standard, chrono functions or whatever of the W language. So instead of just always giving you that extra 0, they decided, well, we're going to do our durations in hundredths of a second. But standard out in the rest of the world, durations go to the millisecond. So you have to have this cross between the 2. So just keep in mind which format of a duration you're dealing with. Otherwise, you're going to have some issues. And then, of course, I save the user off back so that now I've written out that extra minute. And the reason I'm not, you notice I'm not actually keeping track of, I don't have a global variable that's keeping track of how long they're on the site or anything like that, because I know this is going to run once a minute. So all I need to do is add 1 minute.
Great.
That's what I'm doing, is I'm just adding a minute.
Just on a sideline, we use that time on site. Why don't you use a property seconds plus equals 60?
I'm not sure if I could have done that, or I probably could have done that. Yeah.
That's what I use.
Let's see.
I'm just curious if it will work, because I know for date times and stuff, but I'm just wondering now from a duration point of view, I think it's the same thing, if I remember correctly.
We'll definitely we'll play with that here in just a second.
Yeah.
The other thing to look at is in the analysis, time on site And this will confuse you for just a little while, or it does me. You know, I may be a bit more of a simpleton. There's no duration selection in here.
I realize that.
Yeah,
I
you choose date, and then you have to come over to the subtype and choose duration.
Yeah.
And that, it did not occur to me that duration would be a subtype of date. I mean, I get why they're doing that, but everyone else in the world, durations are a completely different variable type, you know, that really has nothing to do with dates. But in WebDev speak, you have to choose a date and then choose duration as a subtype. So if we run our little page now, it will sit here and run forever. I'm actually throwing up a login screen. I've just got the user ID hard-coded in for our example here. And, you know, we could sit here for, 30 minutes watching this screen if you guys want, so that we can see that it never times out, but that'd probably be a pretty boring webinar. But what we can do is we can come over and look at the analysis. And we can see that it looks like I may have. Yeah, I've been playing with it, and we're up to 31 minutes. Actually, that's in milliseconds right now. Not sure. Again, durations are weird. We'd have to do a display on this. Oh, and you saw there it just changed.
Yeah.
It just added another minute to it. So somewhere I got it increased up to 30 minutes during my playing. But every minute you're going to see another minute of time tacked onto this user. And like I said, the real advantage to all that is this page is not going to time out and the user lose their connection. The other place that we can see the effect of all this is Overhearing Connections. You see that we have this user connection running here, and see they're in active time.
To reset on the minute. There you go.
It just fired again, so their inactive time is never increasing above a minute. Now, normally, without our little procedure running, this would just keep ticking up, and as soon as the inactive time reaches whatever we set our disconnect inactive user time to, they would get thrown out and get that ugly message about needing to restart the application.
So I guess at the same spot, you probably can say, we close down every day at 1 a.m. At that point, it says in 10 minutes we're shutting down or something.
Yeah, there are ways to send messages to the clients and stuff. I haven't played with that too much, but yeah, you can definitely do stuff like that. So that's the basics of having this session timeout, and basically to do a quick review of that, and then we'll start playing with expanding on it. What works for me is I set this to 10 minutes. Because I'm doing every minute, I could really go down to 5. Now, what you don't want to do is set this to a minute, because that's too quick. The two are going to bump into each other.
That's a touch and go.
Exactly. So you want it to be down. You could probably go with 5 minutes, whatever, but you do want a little space between how often you're touching it and what that disconnect variable is. But you can definitely crank down your disconnect variable.
Also,
again,
before
you have multiple sites.
But
Go
you
ahead,
also
Wolfgang.
can't get it too. Sorry, you also can't go too short because before they log in, you don't want to make it too short either, because he might want to log in, and then by the time he's logged in, his username and password, it tells his session is expired. So you can't.
Right.
I would say 10 minutes at least.
Yeah, and again, it depends on how you're doing your site. I tend to do my sites as mixed. They're not completely dynamic, so some of my pages don't have the same timeout issues that other pages do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I tend to do my external pages as AWP pages.
Okay.
So
just another
go ahead.
sideline issue. This is Ajax Asynchronous. I haven't played with it yet myself. What is the time before, if you don't get a back answer from the server, does it kind of indicate it fails, or it does never fail?
I don't know that it ever does, because it's doing a callback event. So, your callback would just never fire.
Okay, so you can do a Ajax and then it could be a minute later. It could be a long process which could take a minute or two.
Now if you do just an Ajax execute, then you're going to get into a timeout situation. And that's going to be whatever that,
yes.
timeout is.
I'm talking about the asynchronous one, yeah.
Yeah. Asynchronous, you wouldn't have that issue because it's doing more like a COM style call where it's just going to get a callback. But if you do a normal Ajax execute, and that's another reason I do an Ajax execute asynchronous, is, theoretically, the user, even if I did Ajax execute, the user really would never do anything. It's not like that code's doing a lot. But, guess what? As soon as something goes on my server and it's under a heavy load, it's going to take it a little longer to respond even to that simple request. And now the user is going to get some kind of a stutter or something in whatever they're doing because the browser has hung up for a few seconds waiting for the server to respond. So by doing it as an asynchronous call, I don't have to worry about, as long as that server gets its signal in the next 10 minutes, we're good.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and the other thing I was going to remind you is if you've got multiple sites, you can also do custom parameters and have a different timeout per site. So, that may or may not be important depending on what type of sites you have. You may need to control that timeout a little different for each site. So you've got your global setting and your site level setting that you can play with on those. And of course, you can also change how often this runs. If you don't want this to run every minute, you can make this run every 5 minutes. You can make it run every 100th of a second if you want, although I recommend against it. So you've got a lot of control over what you're doing. So now let's play with a couple of things, and if our good buddy Wolfgang is correct, he has just simplified this code for us considerably. But that would be minute.
Or put a minute, yeah.
See, somewhere I've still got that whole, I'm getting an extra, one of my calls somewhere is adding 10 minutes versus one minute. So I've still got a piece of code that's not doing that duration conversion correctly somewhere.
Chris says it should be in minutes rather than just minute.
Well, that was the
in the code
property that came up.
Oh.
I think the property is actually minute.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see in just a second here.
You might have to hit F5 just to refresh the table.
He says try and type I for in.
Yeah, no, see, that's working. We just went to 46.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Okay.
47.
Nice.
Not sure what he's talking about in. I think he's thinking about a function, not a property. The property is minute,
Yeah.
hour.
Yeah. Seconds.
Right.
But
So
really handy.
This is
Really
definitely simpler code.
Yeah. Well, it's clearer. Otherwise, you miss a zero. I mean, boogers.
Yeah.
I like that.
It's my luck. I always have one too many or too little.
You know, and that once again brings home the point of why we do these things. You know, the whole point of these things is to, it's not just about me showing stuff. You know, I learn as much as I teach. So now let's do a couple of cool things here. Let's.
Hey, Pete.
Yep. Are we?
How much more? Well, 15 minutes ago, but
oh, okay.
How much,
well,
how much more time do you want?
No, I was just going to play with the Ajax callback, but we can either do that in another session, or we can make that home.
No. Glenn says go ahead because you're on a flow.
Well,
go ahead.
I'm delving into stuff that I have never done before, so
do you want to do that next week?
The flow may sputter pretty quick. Yeah, the flow may sputter pretty quick. So
so
now's a good time to actually stop. But what we could do, and what I will do, is I will make it homework for everyone. Remember, we have that Ajax callback. Go play with that. You could do two things. You could return the total time the user's been online forever,
or just for that session.
Or you could do it for the session. So, you've got two different ones that you could return via this result, which would go into your callback procedure. And then from your callback procedure, you would have to update a static on the screen or something. And all that would be firing in browser code, so it would happen dynamically without any pause for the user at all. And if Andy hasn't fallen asleep there, I may have crossed it. I kind of occurred to me while I was doing this how we can use this Ajax asynchronous with Chatterbox to do some
I heard that.
I was users online.
Yes, I actually heard that, and I was thinking, now I really thoroughly appreciate the fact that you're thinking ahead, since Sunday's coming up and we're going to have our first session, and obviously between the two of us we got to have something to talk about.
The only part of it that sucks is I thought about a web feature, which is my responsibility instead of a Windows feature.
That's right. It's all about who gets run over with the bus and who's driving.
So yeah, that you will probably see some much more complicated Ajax callback stuff going on in Chatterbox. We will add that to
some cool stuff. That's what I think.
So, Uncle Pete now passes the baton to Professor Glenn.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording and restart it for Glenn. Okay. Okay. Thanks again, Pete.